Hello, and welcome back to our second study on SK, which we begin today. We're discussing my book actually, on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, Night of Infinite Resignation. This is a book that you can buy on Amazon.com. But many people have expressed the view that the book needs further clarification and further explanation um, and description. Um, so that's the purpose for the series of these videotapes, is to go through the book step by step, and it'll take quite a few lessons to really do it justice, because SK was not at all easy to understand, but in the end, very beautiful truths come out in his observations of existential philosophy. In the first course, or the first lecture, first class that we had, we got into the introduction, and this is a continuation of that. Where we're going to pick up here is on what SK's analysis of the established order actually is. And some of this is going to sound self-serving, because I don't consider myself particularly a member of the established order. Uh, I don't come from a university background, although I have a degree, or a theological background, but rather as a layman who has a great interest in theology and philosophy, and it's why I think Kierkegaard would be very happy with his great skepticism
of the established order in universities and seminaries. SK observed that so much new thinking really comes outside the established order. I mean, you take into consideration many people who have brought new ideas into the world. You can go to people like John the Baptist. He wasn't highly recognized at all in the established order. In fact, he was rejected by the established order. Jesus Christ, the same thing. He was crucified by the Jewish hierarchy. You go to people like Augustine in history. He was not a person of high repute in the Roman Catholic Church, but rather a humble bishop from Hippo in northern Africa. And I just picked people at random. I mean, John Huss, the great reformer, and Martin Luther. People like William Tyndall, also in Christianity. And you look at people in science, for example, Thomas Edison, and also in the computer world of today, people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, both of whom were college dropouts. So my point is that so many new ideas come outside the established order, and why SK was so skeptical of what he called the established order in the universities and the seminaries. So I think a person like me outside the established order is the perfect person to write this book. And I wanted to make another observation about SK. If you think that it requires primarily intellectual gifts to understand SK, that's not exactly true. What's more accurate is to say that it requires the same existential experiences that SK had. His struggle with depression, the breakup of his engagement with Regina, his relationship to his father, and how in youth he did not fit in. These existential experiences can't be taught. They have to be lived. And actually, I believe it's far more important to have these life experiences
the awakening experience he had, and his born again experience he had. And that allows you to better relate to SK. The intellect, of course, is important, but the existential experiences are even more so. So now I go into his style. SK was a brilliant stylist, great writer, and if you're an aspiring novelist or want to know how to write well, SK is well worth the study. But there are times when he becomes so dialectical, so complex, that perhaps nobody on earth can really understand him. And I've had that experience on a number of occasions. And throughout the book, especially like in The Sickness Unto Death, which to me intellectually was the most difficult book to understand, I try to put his dialectics into what I consider a more understandable form of language. And one of his biographers uh, complained very, very severely about his last name was Drew. I can't remember his first name. But anyway, he complained to Walter Lowry, as far as Kierkegaard, I am at this moment going through the proofs of our translations. It is not a question whether I dislike you or myself most while reading them, and I usually settle it by answering that more than either I loathe Kierkegaard. One of these days I'm going to say what I think of his vile, slovenly style, his clumsy, unnecessary terminology. And I could relate in many ways to this observation about Kierkegaard's incredibly complex mind in unraveling certain aspects of his philosophy. But I have to say this on Kierkegaard's behalf. I can understand this blasphemy to a certain extent. SK could write so beautifully and so eloquently in books like Stages on Life's Way, a chapter in the chapter The Banquet, for example. But then there are other times when he gets caught up and gets tangled in his own boots and steps all over himself. And one of the examples that I use is his analysis of what a sign is. And he goes on for many, many sentences and in a convoluted way to describe this idea of a sign. And it's a perfect example of SK's somewhat overcomplicated dialectics at times and the nature of his reflective mind. What is to be understood by a sign? A sign is the negation of immediacy or a second state of being differing from the first. It is not thereby affirmed that the sign is not something immediate, but that what it is as a sign is not immediate. In other words, that as a sign it is not an immediate thing, it is the immediate thing it is. A nautical mark is a sign. Immediately it is opposed to light or some such thing. But a sign it is not immediately. That it is a sign is something different from what it immediately is. And he goes on in the same highly reflective way for many sentences. And it's just a good example of sometimes in his attempts to explain things, he gets very caught up in a highly reflective dialectical explanation of what, in my opinion, could be explained better. So I try to give my own explanation of what he's trying to say. And this is how I unravel this very complicated knot. If anyone can unravel this passage in simple terms, I would appreciate what it means. But for me, this is what I think it means. I think it would have been simpler to say that a sign is a representation of something else, even though both contain immediacy. In Kierkegaard's terminology, immediacy means a spontaneous relationship with something. That is, the direct or immediate relationship with an experience or emotion. Love, for example, is an immediacy in the sense of an immediate emotion or experience. Then the reflection about this spontaneous relationship would come next, in which the mind would reflect on the immediacy of the experience and put it into relationship with the immediacy of what it represents. So one has to put into relationship two immediacies. I see a sign, and then if I can put that into context with an immediacy in existence that's not the sign, then I can understand what the sign means. And that's why uh, pictures, signs that contain pictures, communicate so much quicker to the mind, because the mind is able to put the immediacies together without necessarily reading the words. And love, for me, is a good example of an immediacy, but that immediacy has to be experienced. And the same is true with the sign. To know what a wet road is, for example, if you're driving down the highway and there's a sign with a picture of a wet, slippery road, or whatever you want to use, you have to know what a wet, slippery road really means to a car when you're driving down the road. And the same is true with love. I mean, these are immediacies, these are existential experiences that you have to experience, and you can't really understand without the experience itself. But, I think what SK was really trying to do is communicate to the highly hyper philosophical thinking of the 19th century, and thinkers like Hegel, and Schleiermacher, and Fichte, you name it. And he used throughout his works, he used the highly metaphysical and philosophical terms that especially derived from Hegel. And Hegel derived a lot of it from Aristotle. So it all goes back to early Greek thinking. And he incorporates a lot of this in his works. Now, a lot of the ideas in his works are a little intimidating to people who are not highly educated in philosophy, but really they go back to simple things, simple truths. SK took great delight in the idea that the educated wise men and the simple wise men were not really essentially different. It's just in the way they understood things. The educated, highly reflective, intellectual wise man needed a deeper understanding for his own intellectual understanding than the simple wise man, who doesn't necessarily have a high education or think reflectively. But in the end, they come to the same basic truths. And to me, it's a very wonderful and beautiful observation that both truths are known, no matter how sophisticated you are and how brilliant and educated you might think you are. You come back to the same things that the simple man knows without having to go through that whole process. Now, this doesn't denigrate in any way the passion, the ambition that the educated wise man has in getting to a deeper intellectual understanding of what he's trying to think. So both the educated wise man and the simple wise man come ultimately to the same truths. The educated man takes a long detour through thought, ideas, and reflection. The simple wise man knows the same truths, but does not feel the same impulse for a deeper understanding. Instead, he is content with what he already knows by just living. So I go into a deeper commentary on my ambition and my reason for writing the book. And I put in a personal comment here. In many respects, this book has turned out to be a commentary on SK's thought, because I felt a need to try to explain SK in more Christian terms. as I've said before, usually SK brought in a lot of philosophical, a lot of intellectual ideas that came primarily from Hegel, Aristotle, and other philosophers like that. Um, he did not speak primarily in his aesthetic and philosophical works in Christian terminology. Then, of course, in his religious works, his discourses, for example, he eschewed all that. And he wrote specifically in Christian terminology. And it was his Christian works he wanted to be remembered for the most, not his aesthetic and philosophical works. As with all truly great philosophers like Socrates, Kierkegaard shows the fallacy of philosophy as a means to understand life's ultimate questions. With the proliferation of knowledge in the empirical sciences, philosophy since SK has been left with an uncertain role. This perhaps in part accounts for one of the most common concepts associated with existentialism, the perception of the world as absurd. With wit and brilliance, Kierkegaard destroys the presumptions of the philosophical system of Hegel and also of every other existential philosophical system. To whatever extent you can say SK wrote a philosophical system, it was only meant to be scraps or fragments of philosophical thought in order to quicken one's mind with respect to the divine, because he realized in the end that Christianity cannot be proven intellectually. It took a leap of faith to believe in it. And so the intellect can bring you up to a certain point indirectly, and then it's up to faith. And this was the purpose of his aesthetic and philosophical works, is to bring each individual who's interested up to that point of the leap of faith. Now, as far as epistemology is concerned, SK can be summarized in this way. As opposed to the Descartes formula, I think, therefore I am, the classic Descartes expression. If I can remember it, cognito ergo sum, I believe. SK would rather put it this way. I am, therefore I am. In the Descartes formula, the premise presupposes the conclusion. For example, if I am thinking, why wonder that I am? For SK, existence is higher than thought. A good summary of how Kierkegaard always placed existence to be higher than thought can be found in The Fragments, a book we'll get into later on. And he says this: I always reason from existence, not toward existence, whether I move in the sphere of palpable, sensible fact or in the realm of thought. Now we get into SK's concept of existence and what that really means. Existence is a term that means or signifies the predicament of the individual as a combination of both the temporal and the eternal, existing in time, in relationship to himself, to God, and to empirical reality. This concept, by its nature, has to take into consideration the thinker himself, the concrete, the actual, and of becoming. Existence can also have the meaning of to be or not to be. In other words, being or non-being. In this latter sense, for SK, existence itself is always assumed beforehand. It is never proven. With respect to God's existence, for example, in the sense of being or non-being, I assume that God exists in order to prove he exists. It doesn't come through a logical process of thought like Thomas Aquinas thought. Maybe we'll get into a little bit of the scholastic theologians like Thomas Aquinas. But it comes rather through a leap of faith, not by means of reason. Thought can only abstract from existence and concepts of time and space, and therefore is much more limited than many philosophers and scientists realize. Also, S.K. emphatically pointed out in opposition to Hegel and Marx that an existential logical system is impossible, since existence is in process of becoming, and therefore lacks the finality which a logical system absolutely requires. It's obvious that a logical system has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But for the existing individual, there's only a process of becoming. There is no end that he can see. He doesn't know the end from the beginning, and therefore existence cannot be a logical system as Hegel thought. Hegel thought and Marx thought that they had figured out a logical system to explain existence, and for the existing single individual, that's not possible. Now, a logical system is a logical construction, and one example I like to use is a chess game because it's so complicated. A chess game is incredibly complex and complicated, but in the end, it's a logical system with definite rules and procedures and so forth. A Venn diagram, that's a logical system. It has a logical construction that includes a beginning, a middle, and an end. A syllogism is a logical construction. Or Sorites, once again, a more complex logical system, but a logical system, a beginning, a middle, and an end. But existence does not have that end conclusion. Hegel's misunderstanding of this led him to an interpretation of truth as world history in the spirit of the agency of the state moving through history, as all Hegelian students know. And I learned that way back in 19th century philosophy, and I intuitively thought, what? What is this? And same thing is true with Karl Marx. He turned Hegel on his head, so to speak, got rid of the spiritual aspect, and came up with this idea of dialectical materialism. For Kierkegaard, as opposed to Hegel, he saw in the Hegelian philosophy a disrespect for the common man. He realized and saw through Hegel, way before the damage of Hegel's thinking took place in the 20th century, that what resulted from Hegel's view of truth as the state moving through history was to really deify the state, to make it into a religion. And that's why Bertrand Russell, the great 20th century English philosopher, was, I think, the first to observe that communism is a religion. And the same is true to a lesser extent of all sorts of liberalism, and as Mark Levin would call it, statism, which is a great term. It embraces not only fascism and that is National Socialism, but also communism. It's both basically very similar in that it deifies the state and makes it into a god. And so he saw this problem in Hegel, that therefore the individual only becomes important in his relationship to the state, that he has no greater importance than what he can do or how he can serve the state, which led right into the hands of the statists, and like in fascism and communism, that they could use the individual however they wanted to. But for Kierkegaard, just the opposite was true. As a Christian, he saw that every individual is potentially worth more than the entire human race, because he observed that if only one person in the whole history of the world were to become a Christian and no one else did, that person was more important and eternal than the entire human race. So he observed that Christ died individually for every single individual himself. He died for you, and he died for me. And he has some poignant passages which I just love, and I want to quote them extensively. There is surely a difference between a generation of human beings and a shoal of fish. Although it has now become so fashionable to seek entertainment in the shifting play of colors presented by the human shoal, and to speak with contempt of individuals who are worth no more than herring. Science and world history may perhaps be indifferent to such an objection, but ethics ought surely to have a voice in every view of life. But ethics has been crowded out of the system, Hegel's philosophy. And then also this passage. Each age has its own characteristic depravity. Ours is perhaps not pleasure or indulgence or sensuality, but rather a dissolute pantheistic contempt for the individual man. In the midst of all our exultation over the achievements of the age in the 19th century, there sounds a note of poorly conceived contempt for the individual man. In the midst of the self-importance of the contemporary generation, there is revealed a sense of despair over being human. Everything must attach itself so as to be a part of some movement. Men are determined to lose themselves in the totality of things. Excuse me. In world history, fascinated and deceived by the magic witchery, no one wants to be an individual human being. And you know, I'm reading a great book on the 20th century theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And he had such a, this is the book, Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Prophet, Martyr, Spy. And the messages of both SK and Bonhoeffer are quite similar, and we'll see that going through all of SK's writings. But the incredible thing about SK was he predicted all this way before the 20th century, some 50 years or more before the 20th century actually got going. Bonhoeffer himself was one who saw it right, who experienced it existentially, who lived through it, and was ultimately martyred by the Nazis when he stood up to them. So the profound prophecy of SK we see coming to fruition, to its dangerous conclusion. And that's why in so many ways SK was such an incredible prophet of the 20th century. When the state becomes the ultimate truth, it is very easy to murder 6 million Jews in Germany. It is also easy to starve and murder millions of people throughout the world in places like the Soviet Union. The state is everything to their thinking. The established order and the individuals do not amount to anything but a school of herring, as SK said. Okay, I think that'll wrap it up for this class, this half-hour class. And half an hour is about the most I can get on the internet at any one time. It takes a lot of memory to upload videos. But you can get them on my Facebook page, or get links, rather, to them on my Facebook page. In our next lesson, which we'll have on the internet hopefully tomorrow, we're going to look at SK's epistemology a lot more, and other ramifications of his thought and other prophecies that he brought about for 20th century thinking, because he was such an incredibly creative thinker. Okay, so, well, let's see, we've got a little bit of time left. And then we'll go into an introduction to how he came about his whole thinking, and the importance of indirect thinking And these are things we'll be studying in the next week or so, and that's all. We're out of time.